If you want to reach me on the internet, by the way, you can find me on Twitter. Girl Code with a U is my handle. So this talk is a bit of a departure from previous talks that I've given. And that's because there's no code in this talk. But that doesn't mean that this talk isn't about code. It is. It's about how code makes us feel and what those feelings mean for us as people and for our work as programmers. It's a subject that we don't really talk about very often because more often than not, we're really told that emotions don't belong in software engineering. Just the zeros and ones, ma'am. No feelings involved. And I remember as a junior engineer learning to avoid the phrase, I feel, because it meant that no matter how technical the words were that followed that phrase, what I said was less valuable. And that's really how subtle this bias towards logic can be in our field. And sometimes it's downright explicit. I'm active on Twitter and I actually see this mentioned often, like this sentiment of code is logic, emotions should not be involved. And I should be really clear here that I am not advocating for emotions over logic. So emotions, they influence how we perceive the world around us. Feelings are not facts. And acting on emotions alone really isn't a good idea. And we know this. This is part of why we distrust our emotions. I think that's kind of at the heart of this logic versus emotions debate. You've likely experienced what it means to have your emotions take over or distort a situation. But that doesn't mean that logic is the answer. So feelings aren't facts, but feelings aren't irrelevant. Emotions have a purpose. Emotions are a feature, not a bug. Even the unpleasant emotions, the ones we try to avoid the most, like anxiety or worry. These are subsets of fear, and fear is a clarifier. Fear can tell you that something isn't right, something is amiss. Or what about anger? Anger can actually protect us. It can tell us when a situation is unjust. It can push us to fight for change. And, that doesn't mean that anger is good 100% of the time or fear, but I want us to acknowledge that these emotions can be both helpful and harmful. If we don't acknowledge that, we can fall into this trap of either or thinking. So either anger is helpful or it's harmful. Either we choose logic or we choose emotion, 0 or 1. Now, in either or thinking, we see two opposing options and nothing else. And when we're evaluating logic and emotions, we often fall into this pattern of thinking. You've probably heard that decision-making should be logical, that emotions need to be removed from that equation. That's choosing one of the extremes, logic or emotion. You need to lock one out, emotions, to use the other, logic. In the words of Professor Trelawney, neither can live while the other survives. So it's Voldemort or it's Harry, but it's not both. And that's fine for fiction, but it really doesn't work like that in the real world. And you know what? I'm guilty of this. I'm guilty of believing that I could neatly separate the rational from the emotional. But then I learned about Eliot. So, like with most psychological studies, Eliot is not Eliot's real name. We don't know his real name. But we do know that Eliot had a brain tumor in his frontal lobe. And we also know that when the tumor was removed, there was a peculiar side effect. So Eliot's emotions were impaired. Now, cognitively, Eliot understood that he used to have strong feelings, but now he just really felt nothing. And this isn't why Elliot is a famous case study. His case is actually famous because the surgery came with another side effect, and that was impaired decision making. So Elliot couldn't even make the smallest decision. His intelligence hadn't changed. His logic was not impaired. He could come up with various options for a given scenario, but he struggled to actually make the decision. A blue pen or a black pen would mean hours of contemplation for him. Now, Antonio Damasio is a neuroscientist who studied Elliot's case. And he theorized that the impairment in emotion and the impairment in decision making were connected. So, this is known as the somatic marker hypothesis. And in an effort not to bend our brains, because it is much more involved than what I'm about to say, I would summarize it as making a decision is much harder when you don't know how you feel about the outcome. And that how you feel about the outcome might be a known conscious feeling, or it could be unconscious. So, feelings can act as guides in our decision making process. Emotion, conscious or not, helps to filter out possibilities. And for me, learning about this was a huge relief because I tend to feel really instinctual about decisions. I won't be able to explain why something feels like the right or wrong decision until maybe later on. And this happens a lot with code. I can look at some code and I get a feel for it before I actually dig into it. And I really think that happens as you gain experience in this field. But for a long time, I really, really struggled with those feelings. Because remember, I wasn't supposed to be having feelings at all and 100% not about code. So I kept trying to separate the feelings out. But after learning about Elliot and the fact that our emotions can really help us in decision making, I felt more comfortable leaning into those instincts, those feelings, which is a really good thing because what we do is made better when we feel. The code we write isn't written in a vacuum. We're not programming in a logic bubble. I want the work I put out to feel good, to myself and to others, whether that's the coworkers I share a code base with or the end user. And the longer I've spent in software engineering, the more I've relied on feelings to guide technical decisions. Because I want a code base that feels like a joy to work in. I want to craft component APIs that feel open and flexible. I want to hear about how an abstraction makes you feel. Are you frustrated? What if we tried it like this? Does that feel better? I genuinely want to know because I believe how we feel about code changes how we work. And a really great example of this is error messages. So we know from research that error messages that are human readable, contextual, and clear are less frustrating and result in shorter debugging sessions. We also know that the message's sentiment matters. So in a study where programmers received either neutral, positive, or negative error messages, those that received the negative messages attempted fewer repeated solutions and were significantly less likely to finish the task. I don't even need to explain that further, do I? Because we have all been that programmer, the one muttering at our screen, maybe threatening the computer with some creative language. Happens to us all. And that's because debugging is an emotional task. So I love debugging. But as I learned from this Twitter poll, not everyone does. I was so surprised by this. I did not expect debugging to get like a measly little 9.4%. But when I think about the emotional quality of these different coding tasks, this makes sense. And it also makes sense that we would want to avoid a task that need such high levels of emotion regulation. So the more emotions involved, the more we need to regulate those emotions. Like sometimes I get intensely involved in solving a bug. It is frustrating me. I am getting overwhelmed, but I don't do the thing I should do, which is take a break. But when I can feel that frustration getting to an unhealthy level, a level that's going to actually prevent me from problem solving, I need to be able to recognize that and take the break. That's regulation. Or if we want a more official definition, the Handbook of Psychology of Aging defines emotion regulation as any action, conscious or not, that alters the valence and intensity of a current emotional experience or is initiated for the purpose of altering future emotional experiences. So what I'm doing in the previous example is I'm decreasing the intensity of the emotional experience. I'm frustrated. I need to lessen that feeling. And the first step is to get some space between you and what is causing the frustration. So I'm getting away from my computer. And then the second step is engaging in an activity that's going to be the opposite of that emotion. So for frustration, I'm likely to go for a nice, relaxing walk about town and a stroll. I'm going to talk a bit more about that. But first, I want to be clear that emotion regulation is not about stopping the emotion. Emotions are not a tap you can turn on and off. And I think that's often what we want to do, what we think we should be doing. But that's an unreasonable expectation for ourselves and for others. We actually have little direct control over our emotions on a biological level. So, in doing research for this talk, I had the wonderful task of reading The Emotional Brain by neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux. And his research is focused on emotions and consciousness. It's a fascinating read. We actually know so much more about the science of emotions than I previously thought. We know, for example, that our cognitive system, so thoughts, reasons, and facts, is separate from our emotional system. And we know that our brains are wired so that the connections from our emotional system to the cognitive system are stronger than the inverse connections. And this explains why emotions are able to flood our thoughts, but our thoughts have little influence on our emotions. So I can think, stop feeling frustrated, stop feeling anxious, feel happy, but those thoughts are really unlikely to change how I feel. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not able to influence how I feel. I can. I can watch a film, I can go to a comedy show, listen to music, spend time with people I love. We might lack direct control over emotions, but we can influence them indirectly. We can't change our emotional state with internal thoughts, but we can and we do change them with external actions. So if I go back to the debugging frustration example, I used external actions as a method to regulate that emotion. So step one, I physically removed myself from the stimuli that caused the frustration. And then I mentioned the step two, right? This is where I actively engaged in an action that is the opposite of what I'm feeling. So a relaxing walk. And this, by the way, was not guesswork. This was actually based on how our brains operate. Since we can't think ourselves out of or into an emotion, we can use that strong connection from the emotional system to the cognitive system to help regulate the emotion. We introduce new emotions, emotions that are the opposite of what we're feeling, and this works, but it's not going to be very quick. Okay, so again, we're not stopping that initial emotion we want to regulate, but over time, it's going to decrease as our emotional system processes the newer opposing emotion. So what I've described here is opposite to emotion action, or sometimes just it's called opposite action. And it's an emotion regulation method that's taught in dialectical behavior therapy, abbreviated as DBT. And that type of therapy is focused on providing skills to manage emotions. These skills and the methods involved in teaching them, like emotion regulation and opposite action, these are based on evidence. What we know about how the brain processes emotions. And there's another skill, mindfulness, that is taught in DBT. Mindfulness is a bit of a buzzword these days, thanks to the rise of meditation apps like Headspace and Calm. But mindfulness doesn't come from meditation alone. Mindfulness is a state of active, open attention to the present. So meditation is one of the examples of practicing that active, open attention, but there are some other, maybe more subtle options like yoga. And what we're attempting to do with mindfulness is to bring some consciousness to an unconscious state. Emotions are an unconscious state. When we're aware of what we're feeling, that's actually us bringing consciousness to that unconscious state. It's like breathing. How often are you conscious of your breath? But you're doing it whether you think of it or not. And it's the same with our emotions. All emotions start as unconscious, automatic responses to stimuli. Sometimes we're aware of those responses. Sometimes. You can think of emotions as icebergs. 90% is under the water, unseen. Now, mindfulness can help us become more conscious of these unconscious emotions. Some of them. That's really the best that we can do, and it takes practice. So what mindfulness asks us to do is to pause and to examine what is happening in the moment. I found that pausing can help me identify how I feel in a situation, where I might be too distracted to notice. Identifying emotions can be difficult. So I want to share with you how I do this. And it's mostly through recognizing the physical side of emotions. All emotions cause physiological changes. And I find this really fascinating. These physical changes are actually universal. We all have an idea of what it means to physically experience certain emotions. So sadness is often described as a weight. It tends to reside in our chest and in our shoulders. Happiness is akin to like a tingling sensation, kind of like a fizzy soda, and it tends to spread throughout the body. And this is why, if you take nothing else away from this talk, I want you to know that there is value in feeling your feelings. What we feel can be unpleasant. Those physical changes can be really uncomfortable. And since we can't turn off our emotions with the flick of a switch, we're often left to deal with the physical sensations for longer than we'd like. For me, this has resulted in suppressing emotions I didn't want to feel. Suppressing is like dimming down the light on consciousness. You distract yourself from that emotional sensation, but it's still there. And what I found was that the more I did this, the harder it became to identify emotions later on, which meant I had a harder time recognizing that I needed to regulate an emotion. And it just wasn't healthy. So deciding to actively engage with my feelings, sit with them, feel their physical presence, not to be dramatic, but it really was life-changing for me. It gave me more information about myself, how I felt about situations I was in, and how to regulate those feelings. The truth is that we don't take physical symptoms of emotions very seriously. Emotions can cause physical pain. Studies have even shown that you can take aspirin to help with emotional pain. But we don't treat emotional wounds like wounds. Wounds get first aid. Emotional pain, we tell people to shrug it off, ignore it, don't take it personally. But what would happen if we treated those wounds with emotional first aid? So before I leave you today, I want to take you through an example of what it means to apply some emotional first aid. And you're going to recognize a lot of concepts that we've already talked about in this talk as we go through this. Now, the example that I've chosen is a rejected code review. Whew. Oh God, I chose this on purpose because, whether we want to admit it or not, code reviews can be the source of emotional turmoil. We created a thing and now we're being told it's not good enough, or we made a silly mistake, or I don't know, name a million other little things that can make us feel not so great. Even if our reviewers are kind, criticism can hurt. And that's because criticism can feel like rejection. And rejection is one of the most painful emotions. Brain scans show that activated regions when we experience rejection are the same regions that activate when we feel physical pain. And in studies of rejection, participants rated their pain as significant, even if the scenario did not seem proportionate to the feeling. Like, true story, being left out of a game of catch with two strangers. Rejection is this painful because we need community. We need it to survive. We need it to thrive. Rejection puts that at risk. We are primed to protect ourselves against it, to go into warning mode when it happens. So when our code is criticized, it can hurt, even when we know it shouldn't. That doesn't mean that it's not a wound worth treating. Okay, so what's our treatment plan? Well, our first step is that we don't take any action at all. Remember that mindfulness asks us to pause so that we can examine what is happening in the moment. So don't take any action, don't respond, take a moment for yourself, just pause. Now, learning that I could pause, not respond, not take any action, and take some time for myself, that has been a transformative lesson for me. Pausing is really an act of self-care. It is taking the time that you need. Now, during this pause, we need to ask ourselves some questions. First, we need to identify what we're feeling. What is the feeling? Well, we know that we're hurt, but maybe we don't know the exact thing that we're feeling. So this is a good time to feel how you physically feel. See if that registers with you about any emotions. See if that comes to mind. Rejection often feels like a very sharp pain in the chest. Sometimes it can feel like your stomach has dropped out of your body. Ooh, it's very, very uncomfortable. Identifying what you're feeling, giving it a name, is just a really big help. Sometimes I also turn the attention to the thoughts that I'm having. I might write them down, even when they're really unpleasant thoughts. And in the example of a code review that got rejected that I might be feeling hurt about, I might notice that I'm worried if I belong on my team. I'm worried I'm not doing well enough. And I can sort of see that start to be like, I'm going to get rejected from my community. And that's me feeling rejected. Now, the other thing that we really have to decide is if what we're feeling is proportional to the situation. So I mentioned earlier that, feelings aren't facts, but they're not irrelevant. They can give you a lot of information. Just because you're feeling something doesn't mean that it's proportional to the situation. A code review, if we think about that logically, it shouldn't cause that much pain. So we know that we need to regulate it. If we see that our emotions are not proportional to the situation, we know that we need to do something with them, help decrease them, and make ourselves feel better. And similar to before, I'm going to choose the opposite to emotion action. which means that first I need to identify what the opposite emotion is. Now, rejection lowers our sense of self-worth and it puts our feeling of belonging at risk. So I need something that is the opposite of that. I need to increase my self-worth and I need to feel feelings of social connection. And then the last step is that, I need to make a plan for how to replenish those feelings. That might be spending time with friends if you're able to, call a loved one to chat. Even interacting with others via online gaming can be a social experience that can replenish us. So that's 100% valid as well. Whatever you can do to replenish those feelings. So, to recap, we paused. We took some time to identify what we were feeling. We leveled it. We decided how proportionate it was, and that helps us know how much we need to regulate it. And then we actually made a plan to regulate it. And these are just some basic steps you can always take. Now, all of these are actually really super hard to do. I know I made them sound very simple, but they take a lot of practice. And so everything I've talked about today, you can go further with all of this. And so the last thing I want to leave you with is just some resources for you, some books that I read in preparation for this talk, some books that I've read on my journey, and I hope that they help you. Thank you all so much.